And good afternoon, Southern Utah, especially St. George. This is Michael Harding here with On the Arts, that show that is dedicated to blowing the lid off of all of these little artistic secrets that we have going on down here in Southern Utah. Again, I have been absolutely blown away by the amount of artistic opportunities that are here, not only for people to experience and observe these things, such as plays and concerts and a lot of art displays, but also to participate. We've had a lot of guests on who have invited folks to come audition for musical groups or even audition for some shows. Now, that being the case, I do want to let everybody know about some auditions that are coming up. Now, these are going to be part of Dixie State University. There are going to be two shows that are being auditioned. The first is Rumors by Neil Simon, who unfortunately passed away not too long ago, but a very, very funny farce that we're going to be looking at here at Dixie State University. And that'll be directed by Michael Eaton. Several of you may have seen the recent show that he directed, Hello, Dolly, at St. George Musical Theater. He's very excited to join us in directing here at Dixie State. He does work as an adjunct here. And also, we'll be doing The Wake of Jamie Foster by Beth Henley. A lot of people call it The Poor Man's Crimes of the Heart. I like to call it a really great play in its own right. I'll be directing that one, actually. Very, very excited to look into that. Now, we do have two very special guests in the studio today, two people that I have been working with actually quite closely over the last few weeks. Before we get into who they are, and I'm going to leave this a mystery for just a little bit, I always like to start out with some personal experiences that tie or connect me to the guests. And I want to talk about what a strange breed theater people are. I'm going to go back all the way to when I was in undergrad a very long time ago, and this was in Virginia, and I was actually a double major. I was a psychology major and a theater major. I thought, oh, they go together perfectly, and a geology minor, but we won't get into that. We all make mistakes. Anyhow, I remember I was in abnormal psychology, and this was my junior year. I was all set to get my degree in psychology and have that be my real job, which will that'll play into what I'm about to say in the conversation that we do have. But I remember the teacher was showing us some videos of some people that were stereotypically abnormally psychologically challenged and such. And I remember just sitting back thinking, I have weirder friends in the theater. And I decided at that time, perhaps I would do a little more damage in the field of psychology than I would actually be helping people. And I felt like I really did have a handle on the people that I was sharing the performance space with, more so than people coming in to sit on a couch and get therapy. Well, I've continued with this thought that theater people are an extraordinary lot. Now, that doesn't mean better or worse, but we certainly do look for something else. And one of the taglines that I'm very, very fond of is, life is real, theater is more. I've always enjoyed that outlook of how theater can enhance the life experience, how we can look at other people's experiences, how we can almost experience their experiences to a varying level and such. Now, when I first started teaching here at Dixie State University, this was a little bit over 10 years ago, I had come from what I consider to be quite a successful acting career. I was in Seattle, and I'd been working all over the country, supporting myself and a family as an actor, a feat that a lot of people said couldn't be done. And I'm here to tell you, look, it's contract work, okay? You can make this happen. But I came from a career like that, and for various reasons, came here to Southern Utah and started teaching. And by the way, this is something that might also come up as an opportunity to talk about later on, the responsibility that artists have once they reach a certain stage to share their knowledge, share their experience, and train the upcoming generation. But I had only been teaching for about a year, and I was giving a conference talk at NYU. And, I thought, oh, wow, I've really made it in academia. But I was really missing going on the auditions and performing every single day and working as an actor full time. And I met up a friend of mine, a guy named Paul Hope, who I had worked with him for several years at the Shakespeare Festival and also had run into him in Seattle a few times. And he had worked in Washington, D.C. at the Shakespeare Theater when I was in D.C. And so we knew each other quite well. We'd run into each other over a few years. And I met him for coffee at a little coffee shop. And I remember how strange I realized theater people were, and I include myself in that. He was talking about how much of a struggle it was for him in New York to get work. And in all honesty, he had not done any work acting-wise for over 2 years. At that point, he had been supporting himself as a bartender and doing handyman jobs and things of that sort. And he just looked at me and he said, "I envy you. You have a solid job. You have health insurance." And the part that really struck me as so odd was I was looking across the table thinking exactly the same thing. I envy you. Working to the bone, here on the streets of New York, being an actor and such. And I realized what a strange thing to envy when it comes down to it. But there is this love, this adventure of being a theater person, being an artist. And we do have in the studio today two people who I'm very, very excited to get their perspective on as far as what's happening in theater today, what it's like to be a working actress in theater today, what it's like to have seen the development of theater both regionally and in New York and such, and to be practicing art here in Southern Utah. We have first, I'd like to welcome Rob Goodman, who was a resident director at Milwaukee Repertory Theater for quite a while, and also the founder of an organization called First Stage. Welcome, Rob, to the studio.
Thank you, Michael. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. And we also have with us Rachel Schmeling, who is a young actress. I have to say, I look across at Rob and I say, okay, we're of a generation that we can look at the youngster in the studio, Rachel Schmeling. But she is a working actress in New York City right now. She's gone and she's taken the plunge, and I'm very interested to find out what her experience has been as well. Rachel, welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Now, I do have to say, we've mentioned on this show before a project that Christina and I have been working on, which is the play Framed by a playwright named Y. York. And we opened last week at the Center for the Performing Arts in Kayenta, or at Kayenta, I think is the proper name there. And Rob Goodman is actually the director of this piece, and Rachel Schmeling is one of the 4 actors in the piece. I do have to say, I think the acting is out of this world, stunning. Rachel is certainly a very, very strong presence and a fun presence on stage to be with. And of course, we also have Jake Thomas, who I've asserted is one of the best young actors we have in St. George, with a lot of potential, and it's a pleasure to share stage with him and everyone else here. Now, I have to ask, why the heck are you here? And I'm going to start with Rachel, actually. Ladies first on that. What's going on, Rachel?
Why am I here? Well, then being an actor means you go where the work is, isn't it? So I know Rob from Milwaukee, and I've been in New York the past 2 years, and I got an email, I think July or August, and Rob asked if I wanted to come do a show, and I just said yes.
How wonderful to get to that point as an actor where you don't go to the audition, they call you, or
I know, yeah,
today they email you. Are you available?
Yeah, that felt pretty good. It's nice. Nice to have those connections all around the country. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Rachel, tell me, you've been there for about 2 years now in New York. How are things going being a young actress in New York?
Things are going. Yeah, it's difficult. It's definitely a hard city to be an actor in, I think just because of the cost of living now, because acting doesn't pay very much ever, and then trying to do it in New York City and pay rent and other bills, it's a lot. But yeah, it's been going very well. I'm always working on a project. I don't think I've gone more than a few weeks without working on something, which is not something that everyone can say.
Gotcha.
City. Yeah.
That's absolutely wonderful, actually. And when you say working on projects, are these all paid projects? Are these you and friends getting together, or?
It depends. This year, I made a new rule for myself. I don't do unpaid work unless it's like creating something with friends. But in terms of performances or film or anything, I'm going to get paid something.
Good for you.
Yeah. So, but that's been new. That's been new-ish. I work with a theater company in the city. It's an ensemble-based theater company. So I've been with them for the past 2 years since I moved. And between that and anything else I can find, keeps me pretty busy.
Gotcha. Excellent. I actually had a friend who, we can end right there, a friend who lived in New York City, and he said that the way the economy works there, you might as well have a guy standing outside your door, and every time you leave, you just hand him a $20 bill. And I thought, okay, I can see where people might get that perception there. Did you go to New York alone? Did you go with friends?
I guess I Kind of both, because my family is in Wisconsin. I don't really know anyone on the East Coast besides my friends, the people I went to undergrad and grad school with. And I ended up moving into my apartment with two of my friends from grad school. And I do have a really strong base there, but yeah, no family, no one else to really like lean on except those people and the relationships that I created. So yeah, and those two roommates I don't live with anymore. Amicable separation.
I'm pretty sure of the 7 people listening to the show, I don't think they're listening. I don't know that we reached that far. I guess with the internet we could.
Yeah, so that's where I'm at now.
Fantastic.
So it's good. It's good to find a community there and to have built that. Making friends as an adult is hard. That's like something they don't tell you.
Right. After about the 2nd grade, things go downhill, I think. And you mentioned that you went to graduate school. Where was that?
I went to graduate school in Scotland, in Glasgow, the Royal Conservatoire. And it was fantastic. A year and travel and got to study Shakespeare, and it's pretty good.
Gotcha. And was it just to study Shakespeare that you went over there? Or?
Essentially, yeah. I knew I wanted to get my master's degree in classical theater, and I knew I wanted to do it in a year or 2 and abroad. There's like 3 options if you look into all of that criteria. And Scotland is who accepted me and what fit. And the degree is classical and contemporary text. So it's very unique in that we did about half of the year studying classical work, Greek text and Shakespeare. And then we did a lot of devised and new work ourselves. So it was a great combination of things and skills that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Got it. I have to say, in rehearsals, I was very excited to hear that. I've mentioned on the show before, but haven't gone into much detail. I actually got my MFA over at the University of Exeter in England for really the same reasons. You know, I wanted to go abroad. I wanted to take some time. I wanted it to be a short process, and I really wanted to, study text more than anything. So we have more conversations coming on that. I do want you to know. Let's see. Now, Mr. Goodman, Rob Goodman, sitting here. Why are you here? What's going on?
I founded First Stage, like you mentioned earlier, and after a 5-year phase out of being founder, I retired, and I had to find a wonderful place to live. So I asked my wife, Mary, where do you want to live? And she said, it's not where, it's what it has. What do you need, Mary? Sunshine, heat, culture, outdoor activity, near major airports, et cetera, et cetera. And Mr. Google popped up St. George. We had never been here before, ever. Never been to Utah before. Came down for an exploratory visit. On the 3rd day, we were hiking in Snow Canyon, and she said, we're going home and selling the house and moving. And that's exactly what we did.
How great.
Shocked our family, shocked our kids, and we just ended up out here in Ivins, and we rented a place out there for a while, and found a lot out there and built.
Got it.
Now
so
we're, yes?
You had your house built, so it's custom for you?
Yes, we built a house out in Ivins, yes.
Fantastic. Yeah. And you've mentioned First Stage. What is First Stage? I can't speak English on the radio. What is First Stage?
First Stage is what you would call a TYA theater. Okay, so TYA is Actors Equity Association, acronym for Theater for Young Audiences. So it's a professional theater for young people and families. That's what it is. So I hired equity actors, plus I did age-appropriate casting, so we had young people in the cast with the adult professionals. My designers and directors came from all over the country, a lot from Seattle and Chicago, some from New York, but all over, yeah.
Gotcha. And I have to ask, was Carrie Wong one of your designers?
No.
Oh, I was hoping we had a connection there.
Not that one. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Carrie and I actually worked together. He as a designer, myself as an actor at Seattle Children's Theater.
Okay.
And I want to bust a myth right now. I talk at the beginning about how we're blowing the lid off of some of the secrets that are down here. I also like to think maybe we educate just a little bit, and I have to reiterate how much I learn here doing this show and talking to people. But I used to kind of look down my nose at children's theater. And I know a lot of people have this idea of what children's theater is, and they imagine that, these people are bouncing around in a library pretending to be a bunny or something like that. And when I went to Seattle, they had Seattle Children's Theater, and I knew they had connections with other great children's theaters in the country. And I went to an audition one time, not sure what to expect with one of my favorite people in Seattle, Linda Hartzell. She was the artistic director. And I was stunned at the maturity of the building. Even though, yes, it was geared and the architecture was geared towards children and such, there was a maturity of the artists and also a fun of the artists. And it wasn't by any means immature. It wasn't by any means goofy or shallow. And I started to really look into Seattle Children's Theater. And I have to say that was some of the most exciting theater in Seattle. And I think it was because, you had Seattle Rep and you had the Intiman and such at the time that were doing shows that were designed to bring in audiences, and they were trying to be edgy and such and do other work. But at Seattle Children's Theater, they did a Dutch piece. And, I don't know of any theater that would take on the Dutch piece. And it was called Nicky Somewhere Else. And it was one of the first things that I saw there. And it was about a young boy who had been a twin, and his twin had been stillborn. And he was 5 years old. And his name, I can't remember what his name was, but the name of his stillborn brother was Nicky. And I remember the story was about him asking his mother when he was 5 years old, "Where is Nicky?" And she just said, "Nicky is somewhere else." Mm-hmm. And that story just blossomed from there. And it was this really deep, poignant, wonderful theatrical experience. And at that point, I started looking at children's theater extremely differently. The TYA, the Theater for Young Audiences and such. Well, that was my experience. Why start a TYA, Rob? What drew you to that?
Well, I had been the resident director at the Milwaukee Repertory Theater for 8 years, and they had just designed and built a brand new theater space, and they moved out of the Milwaukee Performing Arts Center into that space. And as they were moving, the managing director of the Performing Arts Center asked me if I would like to stay and quit the rep and start my own theater, right? It's just that he wanted a professional children's theater. And at that point in my life, I had never read children's theater. I had never directed it. But I was a young American male with a nice, strong theatrical ego, and I wanted my own theater. So I bit the bullet and I did that. My approach, though, was no different than approaching any other piece of theater. I didn't know how to do theater any other way than the way I was trained and with the skill and the talent that I have. So I approached Winnie the Pooh the same way I approached To Kill a Mockingbird, both of which I directed at First Stage.
Right.
And so you approach it the same way as a professional theater artist. Your audience might be a little bit younger, or they might be there with their parents, etc. But the work is the work, and art is art, and you don't want to I think you mentioned earlier about people looking down at children's theater, and I think there are two reasons for that, okay? One reason is because a lot of stuff they saw was bad theater. I'm sorry, it just was back in the 70s and 60s and 50s and etc. And then the other reason is I don't know that a lot of people approach children as if they're really people. Mm-hmm. They're young, short things striving to become people, as opposed to people right where they're at who are growing and nurturing every single day. And my approach has always been they're people first. And whatever age they're at, that's what they're going to appreciate and understand. And when they came to the theater, maybe they can't articulate their experience like you could or I could or Rachel can. Doesn't mean they're not having the full experience for their age or their understanding of the world and life. It doesn't mean that they can't hear everything that goes on around them 24 hours a day like we do. And it all affects them. So my approach to children and to the theater for children is to do it very professionally and actually to almost take more care, to have more care for what I do, because I have a responsibility. I have a huge responsibility to make sure that it's accessible, but make sure it also brings them to a place where they have a full theatrical experience that empowers their life, that empowers their soul, empowers their spirit, that gives them like hope for the future, if you will. And so every piece that we did, that was the basis for it. Every piece that we did.
Well, you mentioned that you did To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff when you think about it. How was that received, To Kill a Mockingbird for kids?
It was received extraordinarily well because obviously you're not going to bring your third grader to it, but you bring your seventh grader to it, your sixth grader to it. I mean, how old is Scout in the book?
That's
How
right.
old is Jeb?
They're young.
They're
They're
young.
very young, aren't they?
They're
like-
young.
They're 9 and 7, aren't they?
They're
Or-
elementary age kids, right? Trying to figure out what does racism mean in this world that I live in. So it is appropriate material if you produce it, direct it, present it, act it in a way that's accessible to your audience. And I don't mean dumb it down. Don't ever dumb down anything, okay?
Kids know. Kids know when something's dumbed down.
Absolutely.
So you have to have high expectations, and they always meet your expectations, is my experience. So To Kill a Mockingbird was very well received.
Excellent. Well, I worked with a guy named Dominic Dromgoole, and I can't really call him a friend. He was an acquaintance that I worked with. That word friend gets thrown around the theater quite a bit. Oh, I'm friends with. No, I worked with this guy, which means for a week we were in the same building, really. But Dominic Dromgoole, when I knew him, had taken over as the artistic director of the Shakespeare's Globe, of course, started by Sam Wanamaker. And he made a statement that I would love to get your reaction to. I had a strong reaction to it. I think I may have worded it differently had I used it. But he said, and I'm going to warn our audience right now, he was very straightforward and blunt, but he just said, children need the hell scared out of them. And I thought that was a very interesting statement. He didn't mean that he hated kids or what have you, but we were talking about the visceral response that he wanted to get from them. How do you react to that?
I would phrase it differently.
Me too.
You know, I would say that children deserve to have an amazing experience.
Mm-hmm.
They deserve to have an experience that's truly a work of art that can astound them in a way and awaken within them creativity and joy and wonder and curiosity for the world around them and the relationships they're going to be entering into. Children need to be able to experience something in the theater that's going to challenge them in such a way that helps them develop coping skills for living in the real world. And you can do that in the theater. Because in the theater, you know, you're having this visceral but vicarious experience, right? So you're sitting in your safe seat, but you're getting all of the experiences, and you can take that then and translate into your real life. And I think children do that much more than adults do. They have a much greater ability to do that because they're in the learning, growing mode all the time. Somehow, we adults just kind of seem to stop and everything gets stunted in us. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I'd say that was something I really enjoyed about Seattle Children's Theater. The children's audiences, they were the most engaged when it came down to it. I was actually a little reticent to when I got my first contract there, knowing that we're performing at 10 in the morning, really? And they're bringing in these kids. Oh, the kids aren't going to love it. They loved it. Absolutely loved it. And we could have that conversation, that live theater conversation with them.
Seattle Children's Theater, First Stage, my theater. There was one down in Louisville, Minneapolis Children's Theater, one down in Kansas City, and a couple other ones that back in the late 80s and early 90s really started doing very mature work for young people. And one of the reasons that we were successful is that we changed the quality of the work that we were producing, in other words, the plays.
Mm-hmm.
So we started commissioning real playwrights to write plays. I mean, playwrights that had never been asked to write a play for this kind of audience before, a young audience. And it kind of changed everything. And it was like a grand renaissance, if you will, in the whole theater world. The TY Theater became the fastest growing movement in American theater for 20 years because of it. And I'm very proud of the fact that First Stage is we produced over 50 commissioned new plays the time I was there.
Gotcha. Well, I remember we worked with Chad Henry a lot, a very wonderful playwright. Yeah. And there's another playwright that is actually very relevant to something going on right now, a playwright by the name of Y. York. Am I correct that she actually wrote a lot for children?
Well, Y came out of New York City. She worked at Dramatists Guild and Dramatists Playwrights out there as a playwright. And then she moved to Seattle, and she was one of those playwrights that we approached. She was an adult playwright. She wrote plays for adults. And we approached her, would you please write for us in our part of the theater world? And she said, sure. So she actually has written quite a few plays for young people. Yeah.
And how wonderful is that? And it is, I think, quite a remarkable skill.
Yeah.
Linda Hartzell will talk about the skill of staging for children and how they're going to be really honest, and you've got to keep things moving in the proper ways without dumbing it down by any means, but realizing that, these are kids who they want something.
My
and you've got to give
experience,
it.
my experience in that realm, Michael, is like I said earlier, that I didn't approach the work any differently, other than make sure that it was appropriate and responsible, right? But for example, I went to Uzbekistan, to Tashkent, and hired a Russian director who was very famous in the Soviet Union. I brought him back to Milwaukee to direct Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But he wrote the script based on Dostoevsky's The Twins.
Right.
Right? Basically the same story, but not England. And the piece is like incredible, and like all theater, it's symbolic language, right?
Right.
So the set design was designed by a sonographer from St. Petersburg, Russia. So it's all symbolic and very out there. And the kids get it instantly. And you don't have to tell them. They're explaining it to their parents. This is what this means, Mom. Don't you get it, Dad? No, they got it all. So I love the fact that for me as a director at First Stage, I had a giant playground. I was in a giant sandbox where I could experiment with my work, and I could get away with like almost any kind of concept I wanted to. It just all worked for them.
Well, I'm going to tell you, those of you who are listening right now, I do encourage you to check out the live stream that we've got going on Facebook. That's at Radio St. George. And also we are live streaming on YouTube. And this will be archived as well. Now, the reason I say that is because I love watching the guests on this show light up when they start talking about something that they care very deeply about. And if you could have seen the animation that was happening with Rob Goodman right there, it was infectious. So I do hope you'll check that out.
Yeah, getting back to this producing new work and the experience of it all, Rachel was in a show at First Stage in Milwaukee. It was called The Happy Elf. Now, it's a Christmas show, right?
Right.
So when you heard that, do you know that story?
I don't.
Oh,
Of course not.
All I can think of is Elf on the Shelf.
They're doing that show. I just auditioned for a theater during that show on Long Island.
Really?
Yes, I didn't audition for that show, but yeah.
So
anyway,
Harry Connick Jr. had done the music for a little, 28-minute video on television, right? So I contacted him through his agent, and we, over a couple of years, worked out the deal that we would do a whole play based on his music. So I worked with Harry Connick Jr. He wrote, a half a dozen new songs for the show, et cetera. And Rachel was in the productions. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the production values and how that worked.
Sure.
That was a question I had. What is your connection to First Stage? But yeah, let's dive right in.
Yeah, well, that's how I met Rob. I took classes at First Stage and started performing when I was 12 there. And I do think that Rob doesn't know this, but I think it's the reason that I'm an actor. Because I was a child.
I'm sorry.
No, in the best way. Because my experience was theater for everybody. Not assuming that children were any less intelligent than their parents, and parents oftentimes having the most visceral reaction to the shows. And so when I did The Happy Elf, that was one of my last shows I did with First Stage. But it was incredible. I mean, we're treated like professionals, not like children. Treated like professional actors. And working with that sort of script in development that was constantly changing. I mean, that was a new play. We changed things up to that final week of rehearsal, that was an experience I'd never had before.
The leading actor in the show had starred in Urinetown on Broadway, which won a Tony Award.
And then I saw him in The Book of Mormon. We're still in touch, Jared
So
and
you were
I.
working with Broadway actors at First Stage?
Oh, yeah. Multiple. Yeah. Actually, another one of the guys, Harris, who is in it, is my best friend's life coach in New York City.
Got it.
And when we found that connection, we didn't know until a few months ago. And I was like, I did a show with him when I was 15.
So I think again, to say you give young people the full experience, right? when we first opened First Stage, our byline was First Stage, theater for all ages, which is exactly what it was. It was theater, and it was for all ages. So it didn't matter if you were, say you were 10 coming to the show. At the same show, you might have somebody who was 80 coming to the show. You both got a full theatrical experience.
I think I mentioned that show, Nikki Somewhere Else, earlier. I have to admit that I felt a little goofy. I was one of the older people there, shall we say the age challenged. No, I wasn't age challenged. I was age advanced, for the audience. And there was a scene in there where a goose got shot. And, it was a very, very touching scene. And I looked around, and, of course, the kids were affected, but I was crying. And I thought, it's a goose. And that really struck me about how it was telling a story. It wasn't the fact that it was a goose. It was about the relationships and such. And I agree with you. I saw, many grandparents would bring their children, and their children and their grandchildren, and they would be just as affected. It was actually a beautiful, wonderful experience to see how people could share a story like that.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, Rachel, you started with First Stage. If I understand you correctly, you took some classes, and then you started performing with them and such. Did you work other places in Milwaukee?
I did work at a few other theaters. It was primarily First Stage, though, because I had to go to school.
Right. Had to run away to Scotland.
And other theaters didn't necessarily do age-appropriate casting. Right. I think I did a show at an opera theater called Skylight Opera Theater in Milwaukee. That was one of the only other shows I did. And they were just starting to incorporate children into their productions. And I don't know about the rep, but I'd never auditioned for them. They never really did shows with children in them. Even The Diary of Anne Frank. You think about Anne is 13 in that show.
Right.
How often do you see a woman in her 20s playing that? I want to play Anne in that show.
Right.
But where will you see a 13-year-old girl playing a 13-year-old girl? You won't, really.
I think on Broadway, I think James Lapine, when he directed it, was it Natalie Portman? I don't know how old she was when she played that, but she was older, wasn't she?
She's a little bit older, yeah.
When we, like I say, I started at First Stage in 1987. And that time, of the 8 professional theaters in Milwaukee, none of them used young people except for the rep at Christmas Carol. Only in Christmas Carol, right? Because you had to have a Tiny Tim.
Yep.
Right.
And a few urchins running around, right?
Right.
For set dressing. Well, within 20 years later, now, 30 years later, every theater there is no longer afraid to cast young people. And the other thing is that because of First Stage, there is a vast talent pool of young people in Milwaukee, so they can actually cast them. When the rep did To Kill a Mockingbird a couple of years ago, the 3 young people were all First Stage kids.
Fantastic.
All trained young professionals who did that show and did amazing jobs.
Tremendous. And that's where, and Rachel, you've been in New York now for 2 years and such. Are you able to do any TYA there?
There isn't a whole lot. The TYA that's there is mostly tours, and they're mostly musicals. And I do sing, but I haven't. The competition in New York is quite stiff, so I haven't been able to do any yet. But one of the things I really want to do, just in general, is I saw this incredible production when I was abroad, and I saw it probably 2.5 years ago, and it's still one of the best productions I've ever seen. And it wasn't necessarily TYA, but they branded it as family friendly for kids, and it was a show without any text. It was all puppets. It was called Dragon, and it was a story about grief, about this family, these parents getting a divorce and the effect on their son. And it told the most beautiful story I'd ever seen in puppetry and movement. And it was beautiful. And that I would like to try and do in the city. It's quite easy to produce your own work if you have the money and the space and the friends to do it with. And so I would like to start to bring that a little bit more into the city. There are plenty of child actors, though, that do work in the city. I was just in a production of Medea, and we had 2 children in that cast.
And of course, Medea, that comedy.
The comedy Medea, if you all know it, yes. Yeah, but we killed those kids on stage. Well, I didn't.
The
but
way you said that so sincerely.
I know. But it was awful to watch that. But these two kids are so like excited and ready for it and professional. And there is a lot more, I would say, age-appropriate casting, if not specifically theater for young audiences in New York, because they're not afraid to cast children as children,
Right.
because the children grow up around it.
Yeah.
Much more so, I think, than, I mean, Milwaukee is a pretty theatrically inclined city anyway, but New York, you just get the like condensed version of it, right? It's all there.
And I think that
Yeah.
the Billy Elliots of the world
Oh,
and other shows
definitely.
like that,
Yeah.
that made producers realize, no, we can actually do age appropriate casting in New York, and it's not a
Right.
problem. you know.
And that these kids are going to be like kids, but professional and kind. And there's always, I mean, The Lion King has had kids for however many years, you
forever.
know? Yeah.
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 Well, I'm struck by it was just a few years ago. Neil Patrick Harris, of course, has hosted the Tony Awards quite a few times, actually. And I remember, I think it was when Matilda was on Broadway, and another theatrical icon, Mike Tyson, was doing a one-man show and such. There was a lot of interesting stuff going on. But I remember he did this opening, which is lauded as one of the best openings for the Tony Awards. But a line that really struck me in that song was, "How did Broadway become daycare?" And he was talking about all of the children on Broadway with Billy Elliot and with Matilda, and just all the rules that had to be set up of you can only use them for so many hours, and they have to have their schooling in place and such. I think it's a wonderful trend, certainly. I mean, going all the way back to Gavroche in Les Miserables. I know a lot of kids who desperately wanted to be that, or young Cosette, or these roles. Now, you can also go the other way. I'm going to bring in Jake Thomas, who's also working with you and myself, Rachel, as an actor in the show, and also directed by Rob Goodman. He's actually a teacher at the Vista School for the Performing Arts, and they're going the other direction. They're casting their kids as adults. They're actually taking over for the Dickens Festival this year here in St. George, which also does travel up to Salt Lake. It has been in the past that it's been age-appropriate casting for A Christmas Carol and also Oliver. So in Oliver, there are a few kids in Oliver. But for Christmas Carol, it's always been age-appropriate. Well, they've been approached, actually, to do their version of Oliver. They have plenty of kids there, let me tell you, but they also have children who are playing Mr. Bumble and who are playing Mr. Sowerberry, and all of these. Even Bill Sykes, I believe, is a very intimidating young man, as far as I understand. But how wonderful the kids are getting these opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. I think that any opportunity for a child in today's world to be creative and fully express themselves in whatever way they want to is exceptional. And I mean, if you have a kid playing an 8-year-old woman, or an 8-year-old girl playing a woman in her 40s or whatever, I mean, that child is not going to have the same life experience many years down the road that they might get. But, I mean, it's fun. They know how to play pretend. That impulse hasn't been squashed in them yet. They haven't gone to college.
Right. They haven't become the automatons that we are.
Yeah, well, I think children are just so much more, they're so open and willing to play. And I think as long as the experience is appropriate, they're not necessarily, saying things that maybe they'll ask their parents about later, or but it is also, I shouldn't say that, it's an opportunity to open up conversations
Absolutely.
between children and adults in a much more clarifying way. Yeah.
I told you how we kind of moved here, Mary and I, because we were walking in Snow Canyon State Park and decided, okay, we're going to move here. We knew nothing about the area, literally. I mean, it was really sad that we didn't have more research behind us, but especially at our age, I think we should be more mature about it.
No.
Why?
But, there's been a number of really wonderful surprises for me, is that it's like all of the young people down here are like, all the schools have a lot of performance activity, whether it's music or dance or whether it's theater. And there's so much activity for the young people. It's just kind of natural for them to get involved in being in front of the public and public speaking and performance activity. I think that is absolutely brilliant about the Utah culture. I love that. I just absolutely love that. The other thing I love is the fact that now that I'm retired and I'm moved here, I get to direct adult plays now and then. Right? Because literally, I directed Frame, like you said, out at the Center for the Arts in Kayenta, but it's the first adult play I've directed probably since I did Dead Man Walking, which must be probably 10 years ago.
Uh-huh.
So it's been a long time since I did an adult play, and it was just such a delight to be able to dive into the material with a group of artists, you guys included, and just go as deep as we could and just keep going and going and going with it. I really, really had a wonderful experience doing that.
Now, let me ask both of you. We've been talking about kids
Yeah.
and talking about TYA and a little bit about where you both come from. You're both obviously very passionate about theater and the possibilities of it. I'm going to start with Rachel on this one. Why? How'd you get into theater? I mean, was it just you went to try something at first stage, or was it something that from the age of 3 you were presenting plays for your family, which is actually a very common thing.
What's funny? I just saw a meme about that. It was like if you weren't making up dances with your cousins, your life wasn't lit. And that's you know what? It was plays. Well, I joke because my parents tried to put me into sports. I just didn't. I wasn't good at them. And I got bored. I got bored really easily. I still get bored fairly easily. And theater was the thing that kept my attention because theater's always changing. It's all about being present. And me as Rachel, I change every minute of the day. So it makes sense that my character would change. And you're talking about contract work you could work on a play for 4 weeks or 6 months or 2 years, but it will end. Your time with that will come to a close and you'll have to find new work. And so, once I started taking classes at First Stage, I was just like, this is it. This is what I want to do, especially Shakespeare. That's what I still want to do all the time now. So thank goodness.
Why Shakespeare?
Why Shakespeare? I loved it. I don't know. I loved speaking the language when I was 8. I loved being a witch. I loved being a witch in Macbeth when I was 8 years old, and I was like, this is amazing. And I just grew to love it from there. And it was kind of the only thing I was good at. And I was like, okay, well, let's try going to college for it. And so I did. And it was still kind of the only thing I was good at. And then I was like, all right, well, I'll go to grad school because I'm scared of moving to New York. And
put it off a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I ended up anyway. And, I'm a yoga teacher as well in the city. It's just like you were saying, your friend, you kind of have to have another job. I mean, even I've had friends on Broadway that haven't given up their bartending gig because Broadway doesn't pay that much unless you're
and it will end.
And it will end.
Yeah.
Right? It will end. And so I teach yoga and I love teaching yoga. I love that. But then when I take these contracts out of town and I don't have to teach, I'm like, wow. That acting is what I want to be doing. I want there to be a time where I don't have to have a second job all of the time. Or maybe it's, one-offs here and there. But I don't think you become a creative artist, any kind, if you don't have a passion for
Right.
it. Because when that passion stops, your work will stop. That's just the story. So.
Well, addressing the fact that work will end. There's kind of this romantic notion that I think a lot of people go with of once you've made it, you've made it. A friend of mine named Conrad Ricamora, he lives in New York right now, and he had the good fortune of going there. He was in Bart Scher's The King and I. Actually, he got cast in that. He had the perfect look for it, and he did that for a while and was very successful. We all looked at him as, oh, you've made it. But then, of course, that ended for him. And he's now on the show How to Get Away with Murder. And he's living very nicely in New York. He has a bulldog. He has a pet in New York. And he has actually a very nice apartment, which in New York, it's rather spacious, which a lot of people are saying, wow, you've really made it. But even he, when I talk to him and such, he's like, I've got to start saving. I've got to start being ready for when this gravy train, if you will, stops. And it's amazing to me. A lot of people forget that it is show business. They forget that second part of it as far as making a living and what have you. So how wonderful if you've got both the passion and the business savvy to make things happen.
Yeah, well, they don't teach you the business part of it all the time. That's a little trial and error,
Right.
and tenacity. I think I was one of my voice coach in the city in my first few months here. She would always say, like, Rachel, you just need to stay here longer than anyone else. You just need to stay here because all those people who don't care enough, they'll leave.
Right. Well, it's kind of like I'm actually aging into the roles that I really wanted to play. I was never Tom Cruise, and a lot of people would say, well, thankful for that, but I don't think Tom is listening to this show, so I think we're okay with that. But, I was always kind of a character, and I am actually watching that. A lot of my competition, they don't look like they used to look. I've always been a dumpy white guy, so I'm now aging into those roles I can play. But I think that does naturally happen. A lot of people get tired of it. My roommate in college, great guy and a great actor. As far as I'm concerned, I really admired him. He's working as a nurse now. He's very happy. He got out of the business. He wasn't happy with it. So there is a little bit of attrition that works to our advantage, I would say.
Yeah, and the other way as well. I was talking to one of my friends this morning. We were just texting, but he was talking about how he wasn't super happy in his job, and he kind of always wanted to go back to music. And I was like, there's no law that says you can't change careers. And I think people stay in things or don't follow their passions necessarily all the time because it's scary. It's scary to not make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
It's scary to be in your 40s and be like, wow, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't have that experience quite yet, but I mean, like it's.
Both Rob and I look at each other saying, "Yeah,"
but it happens. I mean, another friend of mine is changing careers, and there's similarities, but he's going into his 30s, into medical school, like has a little bit of an edge on these 20-year-olds, but still, it's like I think people are afraid of the shift or afraid of the instability. Sometimes, in either direction. I might quit acting in 5 years. I have no idea. I don't want to right now, but I'm also open to seeing where life takes me, and we'll see.
I spent 4 years at the University of Minnesota majoring in physiology.
Uh-huh.
So I do have minors in chemistry, physics, math, and biology.
Wow.
And but then I was drafted and spent a year in Vietnam, and that experience changed me so much that when I came home, I said, well, I can't do that anymore. That's not who I am. But prior to that, I had spent all my afternoons in the chem lab, but all my evenings in the theater. Mm-hmm. And that was where my heart was, and that's where my passion really lied. And so I said, I'm going to go into theater. I'm just going to do that. So meanwhile, I had gotten married. I had 2 children. And my wife, Mary, she said, oh, if that's what you want to do, let's go do it. I mean, I guess we were both kind of young and foolish, right?
Thank heavens for that sometimes.
But we did it. And I'll never forget my first play I ever saw. It was 1960. And I was going to be a freshman in high school. My family moved from Montana to Minnesota. And my high school English teacher, Miss Petuzak, took the class to see one of the, I think it was Henry IV, or one of the history plays, Shakespeare, at the opening season of the Guthrie Theater.
Mm-hmm.
George Grizzard, Jessica Tandy, Hume Cronin, all those people up on the stage. And I didn't know who they were. But what they did and the experience I had as just a little freshman in high school, it just totally blew me away and changed my life. And, the theater has always been like a deeply spiritual place for me. It's a place where my soul is really fed. And it's a place where I can explore ideas and feelings and things that I can't explore any other way. But I can explore them in the theater in a vicarious sort of way. And so for me, pursuing the theater was like I was trying to pursue some place where I could find something that fed me in such a way that I would actually have life and be alive. You know what I mean? I had seen too much death and destruction. I was only interested in life. I was only interested in hope and only interested in what gave value to us being human beings. And so, yeah, I'm going to go off and do theater, right? So I did. And I guess it's just luck or blessing or whatever you want to call it, but I had a life in the theater. I don't know how you do that. That's very, very difficult. Like you were able to do it and are still doing it. And it's a profound thing for me personally. And to think that along the way I was able to, produce some shows or direct some plays that touched other people in ways that affected them and touched their lives and moved them in a way maybe towards more life, if you will. I think that's what's important about performance arts. Whether it's music, theater, dance, or performance art or whatever it is, be able to bring people into a space and challenge them with feelings, emotions, ideas, images, etc., or things you can't even articulate, but things of the heart, things of the soul, things of the spirit that are deep, to touch those places in people and have them walk out of the theater changed a little bit. Sometimes a whole lot, but at least a little bit. I think it's really important and really wonderful.
Well, I have to tell you, I have one thing that I'm very excited about. I thought that was a wonderful way of summing things up, if you will. The reason I say summing things up is this is always the case with this show. We're out of time. I always, at the very beginning, I think, okay, now what are we going to talk about? Are we going to be able to keep the conversation going? It hasn't been a problem yet. And I will tell you, what a wonderful way to put why to do theater, what theater means to you. And thank you, Rachel, for your thoughts as well onto what it is to be a young actress going to what a lot of people say is the ultimate step, going to New York and such. I do want to invite all of our listeners to come check out the work of the two guests we've had today, Rachel Schmeling and Rob Goodman. Rob Goodman being the director and Rachel Schmeling being an actor in it, as well as some work that I'm rather proud of as well, with a wonderful cast. The production of Framed. Please know this is by Y York, and it'll be performing this week at the Center for the Performing Arts at Kayenta at 7 p.m. on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 7 p.m. each of those nights, as well as 3 p.m. on Saturday for a matinee performance. Please do check that out. Also know that Alice in Wonderland is playing here at Dixie State University. A wonderful presentation of a very bizarre story. If you haven't actually read Lewis Carroll's novel, I can't say go do it, but I will say try to do it. I don't know. It's that's a whole conversation. And then on Thursday, please do join us again at 4 p.m. for On the Arts, where we have a guest, Latressa Smith, a local songwriter who has done some wonderful, wonderful work. We actually had a few local songwriters on just a few weeks ago as well, talking about their expression and what music and performance means to them. But until we hear each other again and until you tune in, please remember to keep your focus on the arts.